Hi and welcome to the Archive of History. It is just before dawn in a valley cradled between forested mountains. The air hangs thick with moisture, carrying the scent of cedar wood and wet stone. Somewhere in the darkness, a temple bell tolls once, low and deep, its sound rolling across tile rooftops and narrow lanes like a wave across still water. In this moment, in this hidden basin surrounded by peaks, an ancient city stirs. This is Kyoto, a place where over 1,000 years of Japanese history has layered itself like sediment, where emperors once ruled from gilded halls, where samurai walked beneath wooden gates, where monks chanted sutras in smoky temples, and where the most refined culture in all of Asia was slowly, carefully cultivated. Tonight we will walk through the hidden corridors of this sacred city. We will explore its gardens of raked gravel and its alleys perfumed with incense. We will witness the birth of an imperial capital, the rise of warrior clans, the devastation of civil war, and the slow emergence of a culture so refined, so devoted to beauty and impermanence, that it would define an entire civilization. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. And now, settle in, let the noise of the modern world fade away. Close your eyes and let us travel back to a time of silk robes and paper screens, of moonlit temples and quiet tea rooms, to the hidden city of 1,000 shrines. The story of Kyoto begins not with stone or ceremony, but with a decision born of desperation and ambition. In the year 794, the Emperor Kammu stood at a crossroads. The imperial capital of Nara had become impossible. For decades, the great Buddhist monasteries there had grown too powerful, their monk soldiers interfering in matters of state, their abbots whispering in the ears of princes. The sacred and the political had become so tangled that the emperor could no longer govern freely. The court was suffocating beneath the weight of religious intrigue. Something had to change. And so Emperor Kammu made a bold and irreversible choice. He would abandon Nara entirely and build a new capital from nothing. A city designed from its very foundation to embody cosmic harmony and imperial authority. The site he chose was a long, narrow basin in the province of Yamashiro, surrounded on three sides by gentle mountains. To the east rose the peaks of Higashiyama. To the west, the ridges of Arashiyama. To the north, the sacred Mount Hiei stood like a guardian. The Kamo River flowed through the valley, clear and cold, fed by mountain streams. It was a place of natural protection, good water, and auspicious geography. The Chinese art of geomancy, known in Japan as onmyodo, declared the site nearly perfect. Water flowed from the northeast, the direction of demons, washing away evil. The mountains formed a protective embrace. The spirits of the land, the Kammu, were strong here. The emperor named his new capital Heian-kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility. It was an aspirational name, a prayer cast in syllables. The city was to be laid out in a perfect grid, modeled on the great Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an in China, the most magnificent city in the world at that time. Imagine standing in that valley in the earliest days of construction. The old forests are being cleared. Thousands of laborers, conscripted from across the realm, move through the mud and stumps. The sound of axes and saws fills the air. Surveyors stretch ropes and drive stakes into the ground, marking out the grid with obsessive precision. The city will be shaped like a rectangle, 4.5 kilometers from north to south, and 5.5 from east to west. At its northern end will rise the greatest structure of all, the dairy, the imperial palace, facing south as all palaces must, gazing down the central avenue that will bisect the entire city. This central avenue, called Suzaku-oji, will be 85 meters wide, a river of packed earth and gravel running straight as a spear from the palace gates to the great southern gate of the city, the Rashomon. The city will be divided into two halves, the eastern sector called Sakyo, the left capital, and the western sector called Ukiyo, the right capital. Each sector will be further divided into 9 districts, and each district into 16 blocks. It is a city designed as a mandala, a sacred geometry made manifest in wood and tile. The construction takes years, and every detail is attended to with meticulous care. You would see the wooden framework of great halls rising slowly into the sky, timber by timber, beam by beam. Carpenters, their hands calloused and precise, fit mortise and tenon joints without a single nail. the wood groaning as beams slot into place. These craftsmen are masters of their trade, men who have spent their entire lives learning to read the grain of wood, to understand how cypress and hinoki and keyaki will age and settle. They know which trees to select, which sections of trunk are strongest, how to cut and shape the wood so that it will last for centuries. Roofers lay thousands of curved ceramic tiles, each one individually fired in kilns along the river, their surfaces glazed to a soft gray that will darken beautifully with age and moss. The process of tile making is itself an art, requiring precise control of temperature and timing. The clay dug from specific hillsides, mixed with water to just the right consistency, shaped on wooden forms, dried in the shade, then fired for days until the clay transforms into something approaching stone. The palace complex is vast, a city within a city. It contains not just the emperor's residence, but audience halls where he will receive foreign dignitaries and conduct ceremonies, administrative buildings where scribes will record the business of the realm, gardens designed to represent the Buddhist Pure Land, and storage houses where rice and silk and precious objects will be kept. The columns are made from massive cypress trunks, each one perfectly straight, selected from forests far to the south on the Kii Peninsula. Teams of oxen drag these enormous logs through mountains and valleys, a journey that can take months. When the logs finally arrive in Heian-kyo, they are stripped of bark, shaped with adzes and planes, and raised into position using systems of ropes and pulleys, dozens of men straining in unison as the columns rise skyward. The floors are raised on posts, keeping the buildings above the damp earth, a crucial adaptation to Japan's humid climate. Beneath the floors, the air circulates freely, preserving the wood from rot and insect damage. The interiors are austere but luminous. Walls are made of sliding screens covered in white paper that glows softly when light passes through, creating an atmosphere of serene brightness even on cloudy days. In the audience halls, the ceilings soar high, their beams painted in red and green and gold, colors chosen to reflect the sacred nature of the space. The emperor's throne sits on a raised platform, beneath a silk canopy embroidered with phoenixes and dragons, symbols of imperial power. When the courtiers gather, dressed in their layered robes of purple and crimson and indigo, the hall becomes a living painting, a vision of order and refinement that speaks to the fundamental harmony the emperor seeks to establish. The city grows around the palace like a garden around a central tree. Aristocratic families are granted plots of land, their size determined by rank in the complex hierarchy of the court. A high nobleman, a minister of the first rank, might receive an entire city block, while a minor official receives a fraction, perhaps a quarter of that space. They build their own compounds, each one a miniature world enclosed by wooden walls topped with ceramic tiles. Inside these walls, residential buildings face inward around a courtyard garden, creating a private universe separate from the noise and chaos of the city streets. There are quarters for the lord and his family, typically a main hall with separate wings for different members of the household. There are separate buildings for servants, who live in smaller, simpler structures near the kitchens. There are storehouses for rice and valuables raised on posts to protect from moisture and vermin, their doors secured with heavy wooden locks. There are stables for horses, essential for travel and for maintaining status, the animals groomed daily by stable boys who sleep nearby to tend to their needs. The gardens are not wild, they are compositions, carefully arranged to suggest nature while actually improving upon it. A pond might be dug and lined with stone, its edges planted with iris and willow, its surface dotted with lotus blossoms in summer. A small hill might be raised, dotted with moss and flowering plum, providing a vantage point from which to view the garden and contemplate the seasons. Streams are carefully channeled through the garden, their courses determined by principles of geomancy, the water flowing in auspicious directions, its sound a constant gentle reminder of the impermanence of all things. As the city takes shape over the first decades of the 9th century, the Kamo River becomes its lifeline, a highway of commerce and communication. Boatmen pole their shallow vessels upstream against the current, their muscles straining as they push against long bamboo poles, carrying lumber from the mountains where it was cut during the winter months. Bales of rice from the countryside where farmers have paid their taxes in grain, barrels of sake from breweries in the foothills, bolts of silk from the growing number of workshops in the city. Markets spring up along the riverbanks and at major crossroads, temporary structures at first, simple awnings of bamboo and thatch, but eventually evolving into permanent buildings as the city grows and prospers. Vendors call out their wares in loud, rhythmic chants designed to carry over the crowd. The smell of grilled fish and steaming rice mingles with the earthy scent of straw mats and the sharp tang of fermenting soybeans, creating an olfactory landscape that is distinctly urban, distinctly alive. Women in indigo-dyed cotton carry baskets on their heads, moving with a grace born of long practice, their loads perfectly balanced. Monks in saffron robes walk barefoot through the streets, their begging bowls extended, accepting offerings of rice and coins from merchants and housewives who seek merit through generosity. Messengers on horseback thunder down the wide avenues, scattering pedestrians and dogs, bearing urgent communications from the provinces to the palace. The city is alive with motion, with transaction, with the hum of human endeavor in all its varied forms. But the true heart of Heian-kyo is not in the markets or the great avenues or even in the magnificent architecture. It is in the palace, in the quiet, incense-filled rooms where the emperor and his court conduct the intricate rituals that sustain the cosmos and maintain the delicate balance between heaven and earth. The imperial court is a world unto itself, governed by rules so complex and subtle that entire lifetimes are spent mastering them, rules that govern not just political behavior, but every aspect of daily life. From the way one sits to the way one speaks to the colors one wears. To understand Kyoto, you must understand this world. You must step through the gates of the palace and into a realm where every gesture carries meaning, where the choice of a robe color or the phrasing of a poem can determine a career, make or break an alliance, win or lose imperial favor, where beauty is not a luxury, but a moral obligation, a sign of one's cultivation and connection to the deeper harmonies of the universe. Imagine yourself as a young courtier in the Heian period, the golden age of this capital, in the 10th or 11th century, a time when the court culture has reached its fullest flowering. You wake before dawn in your family's compound, roused from sleep by a servant who kneels beside your sleeping mat and whispers softly that it is time to rise. The room is dim, lit only by a single oil lamp whose flame flickers in the slight draught. The air is cold, especially in winter, when frost forms on the inside of the paper screens. You dress slowly, with help from attendants who have been trained in the elaborate process since childhood. If you are a man of rank, you wear multiple layers of silk robes, each one slightly longer than the one beneath, so that the hems cascade in a waterfall of color when you walk. The outermost robe, the whole might be deep indigo, lined with crimson silk that shows only at the collar and sleeves. Beneath it, a robe of pale green lined with white. Beneath that, layers of lighter silks, each one chosen to create a harmonious progression of shades when glimpsed at the sleeve or hem. The effect is called kasa no irome, the layering of colors, and it is an art form in itself, one that requires deep knowledge of color theory, seasonal associations and cultural symbolism. Each season has its appropriate combinations, and to violate these conventions is to mark oneself as uncultured or worse. Spring calls for cherry blossom hues, pale pink layered over white, suggesting the delicate flowers that will soon bloom. Summer demands cooler tones, greens and blues suggesting water and leaves, providing visual relief from the heat. Autumn is the season of russet and gold, the colors of falling leaves and ripe rice. Winter requires deep somber shades, indigo and black and charcoal gray, reflecting the dormancy of nature. To wear the wrong combination is not just a fashion error, it is a sign of vulgarity, of a failure to understand the natural rhythms that govern all things, a moral failing as much as an aesthetic one. If you are a woman of the court, the layering is even more elaborate, even more demanding. You might wear 12 or more robes, the famous junihito, each one precisely positioned so that the collars show at the neck in descending lines of color, creating a rainbow effect that is both striking and subtle. The weight of the silk is immense, sometimes exceeding 20 kilograms, and it transforms your body into a moving sculpture. You move slowly, gracefully, your steps tiny and deliberate, constrained by the weight and volume of the fabric. Your hair, which you have never cut since childhood, falls to the floor behind you, a heavy black river that must be combed and oiled every day, a process that can take hours. Your face is painted white with rice powder mixed with nightingale droppings, creating a pale, luminous complexion that is the ideal of beauty. Your eyebrows are shaved and redrawn high on your forehead in delicate arcs with brush and ink. Your teeth are blackened with a dye made from iron filings steeped in tea and vinegar, a practice called ohaguro, a mark of beauty and maturity reserved for married women and courtesans. To a modern observer, the effect might seem strange, even grotesque, but to your contemporaries, you are the very image of refinement, a living embodiment of the aesthetic ideals that define the culture. The day begins with rituals, for everything in the Heian court is ritualized, formalized, given meaning through repetition and tradition. You make your way through the compound to a small private shrine where offerings are made to the kami, the spirits of the land and ancestors who watch over your family. A priest murmurs prayers in the archaic language of Shinto, words whose meanings have been half forgotten but whose power remains. Incense smoke curls upward from brass burners, cedar and sandalwood, the smell so deeply woven into the fabric of Kyoto that even 1,000 years later it will still cling to the temple precincts, still evoke this moment. After the prayers, offerings are made, rice and sake and sprigs of sacred sakaki tree, placed on the altar with bows and claps. After the prayers, you proceed to the palace for the day's duties. If you are a man of sufficient rank, you might walk, accompanied by servants who carry your writing materials and other necessities. If you are a woman of high rank, you travel in a curtained ox cart, a slow and cumbersome vehicle called a kuriguruma that creaks and sways as it rolls through the streets, pulled by a single ox guided by an attendant. Inside you sit in near darkness, surrounded by silk cushions and curtains, only thin slats of light penetrating the bamboo blinds. You can hear the sounds of the city, voices calling, dogs barking, the rhythmic thud of the ox's hooves on the packed earth, but you cannot be seen. Invisibility is a form of purity, of modesty, a protection of your honor and that of your family. At the palace, the day unfolds in a series of ceremonies and audiences, each one governed by precise protocol. The emperor himself rarely appears in public, for he is too sacred to be looked upon directly by ordinary mortals. He is a living connection to the sun goddess Amaterasu, from whom the imperial line claims descent, making him not just a political ruler but a divine presence on earth. His role is not to govern in the practical sense, making decisions about taxes or military campaigns, but to embody the cosmic order, to perform the rituals that keep the universe in harmony. When he does appear, it is from behind screens or curtains, his form barely visible as a shadow. His face is hidden, his voice, when he speaks, is soft and high, almost otherworldly, modulated to suggest his divine nature. The real power in the court belongs to the great noble families, especially the Fujiwara clan, who have perfected the art of ruling from behind the throne. They marry their daughters to emperors, and when those daughters bear sons, those sons become emperors, with their Fujiwara grandfathers serving as regents and chancellors. It is a system of elegant, bloodless control that will last for centuries, a political arrangement so stable that it becomes invisible, simply the way things are. The court's daily life revolves around aesthetic pursuits, for in the Heian worldview, politics and beauty are not separate. Poetry is not a hobby, but a necessity, a form of communication as important as speech, perhaps more important because it allows for subtlety and indirection. Courtiers compose verses constantly, in classical Chinese, the language of high culture and scholarship, or in Japanese using the 31-syllable form called waka, 5 lines following the pattern 57577. These poems are exchanged constantly, written on exquisite paper, itself an art form, handmade from mulberry bark and decorated with gold flakes or patterns of scattered flowers, folded just so according to complex conventions, attached to a branch of plum blossom in spring or a spray of autumn grass, the choice of botanical accompaniment as important as the words themselves. The choice of paper, the quality of the calligraphy, the aptness of the seasonal reference, all of these are scrutinized and judged by the recipient, and by anyone who might see the poem. A well-turned phrase can win you favor, attract a lover, secure an appointment. A clumsy one can ruin your reputation, end a courtship, destroy your chances of advancement. The greatest courtiers are those who can compose instantly, who can respond to any situation with a poem that is both deeply felt and flawlessly crafted, who can turn even the most mundane observation into an opportunity for artistic expression. It is a kind of social combat fought with syllables and metaphors, a constant testing and proving of one's cultivation. Music is equally important, woven into every significant ceremony and gathering. The court maintains orchestras that perform gagaku, the ancient ceremonial music inherited from China and Korea, but refined over generations into something distinctly Japanese. The sound is unlike anything you have heard before. Slow, stately, almost eerie, the melody carried by bamboo flutes called ryuteki and mouth organs called shu, whose haunting polyphonic drones seem to come from another world, punctuated by drums and gongs that mark the rhythm with deep, resonant strikes. It is music that seems to exist outside of time, a sonic architecture that mirrors the physical architecture of the palace, vast and serene and slightly unsettling in its otherworldliness. Young nobles are trained in music from childhood, for musical ability is as important as literary skill. They learn to play the baiwa, a pear-shaped lute with 4 strings, used to accompany narrative poetry. They learn the koto, a long zither with 13 strings whose sound is like water dripping into a still pond, pure and clear and infinitely sad. To play well is to demonstrate not just technical skill but sensibility, the ability to feel and express the subtle emotions that define a cultured life, to understand the principle of mono no aware, the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence that underlies all beauty. And then there is the art of courtship, which in the Heian court is conducted almost entirely through indirect communication, through signs and symbols, and carefully calculated gestures. Men and women of the court are kept strictly separated, living in different parts of the palace or in different households entirely. If a man is interested in a woman, perhaps because he has caught a glimpse of her sleeve beneath a bamboo blind or heard rumors of her poetic skill, he does not approach her directly, for that would be vulgar and aggressive. Instead, he sends a poem, delivered at dawn by a servant who places the folded paper on a decorative platter and presents it to the woman's attendants. The poem will be full of longing and seasonal imagery, cherry blossoms or autumn leaves, dewdrops or moonlight, something to suggest the fleeting nature of beauty and desire, the fundamental impermanence of all things. The woman hidden behind her screens in her innermost chamber reads the poem when her attendants bring it to her. She judges everything, the quality of the paper, the elegance of the calligraphy, the depth of feeling expressed, the appropriateness of the metaphor. If she is interested, she composes a reply, taking great care with her own calligraphy and choice of paper, and sends it back the same day. This exchange can continue for weeks or months, a literary courtship conducted entirely through written words. If the man is persistent and his poems are good, if he demonstrates true feeling and cultural refinement, he may eventually be permitted to visit her at night, slipping into her quarters under cover of darkness, guided by a servant through the labyrinthine corridors of the palace or estate. Even then, they do not see each other's faces clearly. The room is lit only by a dim lamp, and there is a screen between them. They speak in whispers, exchange poems, perhaps touch hands through the screen. The relationship unfolds in shadow and suggestion, a romance built on absence and imagination, on what is not said rather than what is said. This world of exquisite manners and aesthetic obsession, this hothouse of refinement and ritual, produces some of the greatest literature in human history, works that will define Japanese culture for a millennium and influence world literature for centuries to come. 2 women of the Heian court write works that capture this world perfectly, preserving it in amber so that we can still feel its texture 1,000 years later. The first is Sei Shonagon, a lady-in-waiting to Empress Taishii in the late 10th century, a woman of sharp wit and sharper observations. She keeps a journal of observations, thoughts and lists witty and sharp, filled with the kind of intimate details that official histories never record. Her work, called Makura no Soshi, the Pillow Book, is a window into the courtly mind, a collection of fragments that together create a portrait of a vanished world. She writes about the beauty of frost on a winter morning, how it transforms ordinary landscapes into something magical. She writes about the way firelight flickers on a lover's sleeve as he prepares to leave before dawn, creating patterns of shadow and light that are almost unbearably beautiful because they signal his departure. She writes about the small humiliations of serving a demanding mistress, the anxiety of waiting to see if a poem she sent was well received, the pleasure of wearing a new set of robes for the first time. Her prose is immediate and intimate, conversational yet polished, as if she is speaking directly to you across 1,000 years, sharing confidences and observations about the human condition that remain as true today as they were in her time. The second is Murasaki Shikibu, a contemporary of Sei Shonagon, and possibly a rival, though the evidence is circumstantial and based mainly on a few cutting remarks in Murasaki's diary. Murasaki is quieter, more introspective, perhaps more melancholy than the vivacious Sei Shonagon. She writes a novel, the first psychological novel in the world according to many scholars, called Genji Monogatari, The Tale of Genji. It is the story of a prince, Hikaru Genji, the Shining Prince, the illegitimate son of the emperor by a low-ranking but beloved consort, and his romantic entanglements over the course of his long life. The novel is immense, 54 chapters, hundreds of characters, spanning 3 generations, a psychological portrait of such depth and subtlety that it seems almost impossible that it was written 1,000 years ago. Murasaki understands human nature in all its complexity. She understands longing, jealousy, regret, the way desire can turn into resentment, the way love can become a cage, the way beauty always carries the shadow of its own decay. Her prince is beautiful and charming, talented and sensitive, but he is also selfish, capricious, haunted by losses he cannot articulate. A man who wounds others not out of cruelty, but out of thoughtlessness, out of his own unexamined needs. The world of the novel is the world of the Heian court, transposed into art, perfected and made eternal, every detail of clothing and ceremony and seasonal observance rendered with perfect accuracy. Even today, the tale of Genji is read not just as literature, but as a kind of sacred text, a guide to the aesthetic and emotional heart of Japan, a work that teaches readers how to feel, how to see, how to find beauty and meaning in the transient phenomena of the world. But the refined world of the Heian court, as exquisite as it is, as culturally productive as it proves to be, is not the only world in Kyoto, and it is certainly not the only world in Japan. Beyond the palace gates, in the provinces far from the capital, a different class is rising, a class of men who care nothing for poetry, or music, or the subtle gradations of sleeve colors. These are the bushi, the warriors, men who make their living not by composing waka but by wielding swords and bows. They are the sons of provincial landowners, men of rough manners and direct speech, contemptuous of courtly softness and what they see as effeminacy. They protect estates from bandits and rival claimants. They collect taxes by force when peasants are reluctant to pay. They fight in the petty wars that constantly flare up in the countryside, disputes over land boundaries or water rights or ancient grievances. For generations the court ignores them or uses them as hired muscle when rebellions need to be crushed, but they are not considered truly important, not worthy of the attention of truly cultured people. But slowly, inevitably, these warriors gain power. They are the ones with the skills to enforce authority in a world where authority is increasingly contested. They are the ones willing to kill and die for their lords. The courtiers can write exquisite poems about cherry blossoms and autumn leaves, but they cannot defend the realm against the forces of chaos. In the 12th century, the warrior class explodes into the forefront of Japanese history, shattering the carefully cultivated illusions of the court. 2 great clans dominate the military landscape, the Minamoto, also known as the Genji, and the Taira, also known as the Heike. Both have connections to the imperial family, both being founded by imperial princes, who were given surnames and sent to the provinces to make their own fortunes, distant cousins, many generations removed from the throne, but close enough to claim legitimacy and prestige. The Taira clan, led by a cunning and ambitious warrior named Taira no Kiyomori, seizes control of the court in the mid-12th century, filling the power vacuum left by the decline of the Fujiwara. Kiyomori becomes the most powerful man in Japan without ever claiming the throne, which would be unthinkable. He marries his daughter to the emperor, just as the Fujiwara did before him, creating a blood connection to the imperial line. He places his allies in every important office, controlling appointments and promotions. He controls the flow of rice and wealth, taxing the provinces and enriching his own clan. For a brief glorious moment, the Taira seem invincible, the new power in the land. But the Minamoto do not forget their own claims to power and prestige. They retreat to the eastern provinces, they regroup around new leaders, they wait for their moment to strike back. The war that follows is called the Genpei War, named for the Chinese readings of the characters for Minamoto and Taira, and it lasts for 5 brutal years, from 1180 to 1185. It is a conflict of devastating violence, fought across the entire archipelago from the far north to the far south, involving tens of thousands of warriors and affecting millions of ordinary people. Kyoto itself becomes a battleground. Its carefully laid out streets torn up by cavalry charges, and its wooden buildings vulnerable to fire. Armies of mounted warriors clash in the streets outside the palace. Temples are burned, some deliberately targeted as bases of rival factions, others simply caught in the crossfire. Palaces are looted, their treasures carried off or destroyed. The aristocrats hide behind their walls and pray to their ancestral kami and to the Buddhas and bodhisattvas, hoping that divine intervention will save them. You would see smoke rising from a dozen fires across the city, black columns reaching into the sky. You would smell the acrid stench of burning wood and the sickening sweet smell of burning flesh, for the dead are not always collected promptly. You would hear the shouts of men in battle, the screams of horses as they fall with arrows in their flanks, the wailing of women who have lost husbands and sons. At night, the city is dark and tense, lit only by the flames from burning buildings, the normally bustling streets empty and silent except for the occasional patrol of armed men. The careful, cultivated world of the court is revealed to be fragile, a paper screen that can be torn apart in an instant by the application of force. The Minamoto, led by the brilliant and ruthless strategist Minamoto no Yoritomo and his younger brother Yoshitsune. A warrior of almost mythical skill whose exploits will become the stuff of legend and drama, slowly gain the upper hand through a combination of military prowess and political acumen. The war culminates in a massive naval battle at Dan no Ura, a narrow strait far to the west near the modern city of Shimonoseki, where the Taira fleet, with the child emperor on board, is trapped and annihilated by the Minamoto navy. The Taira warriors, seeing that all is lost, throw themselves into the sea rather than be captured. The child emperor, Antoku, only 7 years old, drowns in his grandmother's arms as she leaps from a burning ship, clutching the sacred imperial regalia, the sword and mirror and jewel that legitimize the emperor's rule. It is a moment of profound tragedy, an image that will haunt Japanese literature forever, appearing in countless poems and plays and stories, the child king swallowed by the sea, a symbol of the impermanence of all earthly power and glory. Yoritomo emerges victorious, the undisputed military leader of Japan, but he does not move to Kyoto, does not seek to displace the emperor or even to live in the splendid capital. Instead, he establishes his headquarters far to the east, in a rough coastal town called Kamakura, hundreds of kilometers from Kyoto, surrounded by mountains and facing the sea. From there he takes the title of shogun, short for Sei Tai Shogun, great general who subdues the barbarians, a military title that gives him authority independent of the court. The emperor remains in Kyoto, powerless but still sacred, still necessary for legitimacy. The shogun rules from Kamakura with the authority of the sword, backed by the loyalty of thousands of warriors who owe him their lands and positions. It is a new era, a fundamental shift in Japanese political structure that will last, with some modifications, until the 19th century. The age of the courtiers is over. The age of the samurai has begun. But Kyoto does not fade into irrelevance. It remains the cultural and spiritual heart of Japan, a city of symbols and ceremonies, the place where emperors are crowned, and where the great temples and shrines maintain their authority, even as real political and military power moves elsewhere. In the wake of the Genpei War, and the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate, a new class of men walks the streets of Kyoto. Their presence a constant reminder that power has shifted. They are samurai, members of the warrior class who serve not the emperor but their own feudal lords, bound by ties of loyalty and mutual obligation. They wear two swords thrust through their belts, the long katana for combat and the short wakizashi for indoor use and for the ritual of seppuku if honor demands it. Their heads are shaved in a distinctive topknot, the hair pulled back and tied, the crown of the head shaved smooth. Their faces are hard and watchful, their bodies lean and muscular from constant training. They move with the easy confidence of men who know violence intimately, who have killed and who expect to be killed, for whom death is not a distant abstraction but a daily possibility. To be a samurai is to live by a code, a set of principles that will later be formalized and codified as Bushido, the way of the warrior, though in this period the code is still largely unwritten, transmitted through example and through the expectations of the warrior community. Loyalty is paramount, the foundation of all warrior virtues. A samurai serves his lord unto death, follows him into hopeless battles, shares his exile if he falls from power. If his lord dies in battle or commits seppuku, the samurai is expected to follow him, to commit seppuku himself rather than outlive his master's dishonor, becoming a masterless wanderer, a ronin, which is considered shameful. Courage is essential, for a warrior who shows fear in battle brings shame to himself and his entire lineage. But courage must be tempered with wisdom and restraint. A samurai does not fight recklessly or seek death for its own sake. He waits for the right moment. He strikes once, cleanly, efficiently. Honor is everything, more valuable than life itself. To lose face, to be publicly shamed, is worse than death, for it stains the family name and affects future generations. The samurai are not brutes or thugs, despite their profession of violence. Many of them are deeply cultured, steeped in the same literary and artistic traditions as the courtiers, though they approach these traditions differently, through the lens of their own experiences and values. They study Zen Buddhism, which arrives from China in this period, and which appeals to the warrior temperament because of its emphasis on direct experience, on discipline and meditation. Zen teaches them to quiet their minds, to achieve a state of no mind, mushin, where thought does not interfere with action, where the sword moves before conscious decision. It teaches them to accept death as a natural part of existence, not something to be feared, but simply a transition, a returning to the void from which all things emerge. They practice calligraphy, writing their poems with a brush dipped in ink, the strokes bold and fluid, capturing in a single moment the energy and spirit of the writer. They cultivate gardens, not the elaborate pond gardens of the aristocracy, but simpler compositions, dry gardens of raked gravel and carefully placed stones that express Zen principles of simplicity and suggestion. They drink tea, beginning in this period to formalize what will become the tea ceremony, performing the preparation and drinking with a precision that borders on religious devotion. The aesthetic sensibility of the Heian court has not disappeared with the rise of the warrior class. It has been adapted, refined, made sterner and more austere, stripped of ornament and excess. Beauty in the samurai worldview is found not in luxury, but in simplicity, not in permanence, but in the fleeting moment. A cherry blossom is beautiful precisely because it will fall, because its life is brief and perfect, just as the life of a warrior should be. The headquarters of the shogunate may be in Kamakura, far to the east. But Kyoto remains vital, the spiritual and cultural center of the realm. The emperor and his court continue to perform their rituals, the ceremonies that ensure cosmic order and maintain the connection between heaven and earth. Temples and shrines proliferate across the city and in the surrounding mountains, each one a center of religious practice and learning. Buddhism, which arrived in Japan from China and Korea centuries earlier, flourishes in this period, developing distinctly Japanese forms and schools of thought. Monasteries grow wealthy from donations and land grants, becoming major landowners and economic powers in their own right. They become powers politically as well, with their own armies of warrior monks, Sohei, who are as fierce and as skilled in battle as any samurai. These monks shave their heads in the Buddhist manner but carry naginata, long-bladed polearms that they wield with devastating effectiveness. They wear robes and armor mixed together, a strange combination that makes them immediately recognizable. Disputes between temples sometimes erupt into pitched battles on the streets of Kyoto, hundreds of monks in saffron robes clashing with samurai in full armor, a surreal and terrifying sight that scandalized the courtiers, but which reflected the militarization of society in this period. The most famous temples of Kyoto begin to take their current forms during these centuries of warrior rule, enduring through fires and wars and rebuilding to become the landmarks that will define the city's skyline for centuries. On the eastern hills, in the district called Higashiyama Kiyomizu-dera, the pure water temple clings to the mountainside like a bird's nest, its wooden halls seeming to defy gravity. It is built without a single nail, an astonishing feat of carpentry, its wooden beams slotting together in a complex lattice, a three-dimensional puzzle of interlocking timbers that supports a vast platform jutting out over the valley below. The platform is supported by hundreds of wooden pillars, some of them 20 meters tall, rising from the steep slope. From this platform, pilgrims look out over the city and the forested hills beyond, a view that changes with every season. In spring, the cherry trees below explode into bloom, a pink mist that seems to float above the ground, attracting thousands of visitors who come to admire the blossoms. In summer, the forest is a deep green, alive with the sound of cicadas. In autumn, the maples turn crimson and gold, creating a landscape of such intense color that it seems unreal. In winter, snow transforms everything into a monochrome world of black and white, the temple's dark wood dramatic against the white hills. The temple is dedicated to Chang'an, the bodhisattva of compassion, represented by a multi-armed statue said to have miraculous powers, and pilgrims come from across Japan to pray for healing, for good fortune, for the souls of the dead. They drink from the sacred spring that gives the temple its name, the pure water flowing from 3 streams, each representing a different blessing, longevity, success in studies, or a fortunate love life. Visitors ladle the water into small cups with long handles and drink, their prayers whispered into the sound of falling water, their wishes carried up to the bodhisattva. In the northern part of the city, the shogun Ashikaga Yoshimitsu builds a retirement villa in the late 14th century. A project that demonstrates both his power and his refined aesthetic sense. The villa's main hall, the Sharadan or Relic Hall, is covered entirely in gold leaf, inside and out. The walls, the ceiling, every surface gleaming in the sunlight like a temple made of solid gold. It is called Kinkaku-ji, the Golden Pavilion, and it is one of the most audacious architectural statements in all of Japan. A building that seems to reject the aesthetic of simplicity and restraint in favor of pure, unapologetic magnificence. The building sits on the edge of a pond, Kyokochi, the mirror pond, and its reflection shimmers on the water's surface, doubling the effect, creating an image of almost unbearable beauty. The villa is designed to represent the Pure Land, the Buddhist paradise of Amida Buddha, a place of perfect beauty and tranquility, where the faithful will be reborn to hear the Dharma and achieve enlightenment. Inside, the shogun entertains the emperor and foreign dignitaries, hosting elaborate parties and cultural gatherings, demonstrating that despite the shift to warrior rule, culture and refinement are still valued at the highest levels of society. After Yoshimitsu's death, the villa is converted into a Zen temple as he requested, and it becomes one of Kyoto's most iconic images, reproduced in countless paintings and photographs, a symbol of both spiritual aspiration and earthly opulence, of the tension between religious ideals and political power. The Zen temples in particular shaped the character of Kyoto during the medieval period, introducing a new aesthetic and philosophical framework that will profoundly influence Japanese culture. Zen Buddhism, which emphasizes direct experience over scripture, meditation over ritual, sudden enlightenment over gradual cultivation, appeals strongly to the samurai class, offering them a spiritual practice compatible with their martial lifestyle. It teaches them to empty their minds, to achieve a state where thought does not interfere with action. It teaches them to exist fully in the present moment, not worried about the past or future. It teaches them to see the Buddha nature in all things, to find the sacred in the ordinary, to understand that enlightenment is not something to be achieved, but something already present, if only one can see it. Zen monks live simply, rejecting luxury and comfort, in austere compounds surrounded by gardens that are themselves meditations on the nature of reality. These gardens, known as karisansui, dry landscape gardens, are not meant to be walked through or used in any functional sense. They are meant to be viewed and contemplated from a veranda or a nearby building, landscapes in miniature that represent mountains, rivers, oceans, the entire cosmos compressed into a small space. The most famous of these is the garden at Ryonji, the Temple of the Dragon at Peace, in the northwest of Kyoto. The garden is a simple rectangle of white gravel, about 25 meters by 10 meters, in which 15 stones are placed in 5 groups. The stones vary in size from small to medium, none of them particularly spectacular or beautiful in themselves. The gravel is raked in straight lines except where it flows around the stones in concentric circles, suggesting water flowing around islands or mountains emerging from mist. The genius of the garden is in its arrangement. The stones are placed so that from any conventional vantage point, at least one stone is always hidden from view by the others, making it impossible to see all 15 at once. It is a puzzle without a solution, a meditation on incompleteness and the limits of perception, on the idea that ultimate reality cannot be fully grasped by the ordinary mind. Monks rake the gravel every day, usually in the early morning, the lines flowing around the stones like water, the act of raking itself a form of meditation, a repetitive practice that quiets the mind and creates a pattern of perfect order and calm. Life in a Zen monastery is austere and disciplined, designed to break down the ego and lead the practitioner to enlightenment through rigorous practice. You wake before dawn to the sound of a wooden gong being struck in a specific rhythm, the sound echoing through the halls. You rise immediately from your sleeping mat, no lingering or stretching, and prepare for the day's first meditation. You sit in meditation, zazen, for hours at a time, your legs folded in the lotus or half-lotus position, your back perfectly straight, your hands forming the cosmic mudra, your eyes half open gazing at the wall, a meter in front of you. Your mind is focused on your breath, counting exhalations from 1 to 10, and then starting over, or contemplating a koan, a paradoxical question that cannot be answered by logic, that short-circuits the rational mind, and opens the possibility of sudden insight. What is the sound of one hand clapping? What was your face before your parents were born? Does a dog have Buddha nature? These questions are not meant to be answered intellectually. They are meant to frustrate the thinking mind, until it gives up and allows direct perception to emerge. After meditation, there is work, samu, which is considered as important as sitting meditation. You sweep the halls with careful attention, each stroke of the broom a meditative act. You tend the garden, pulling weeds, raking gravel, pruning trees, everything done slowly and deliberately. You prepare simple meals of rice and pickles and miso soup, each action performed with mindfulness, with total presence. You eat in silence, sitting in prescribed positions, every grain of rice consumed gratefully, nothing wasted, for even the simplest meal is a gift from the universe. You study sutras, ancient texts, though Zen emphasizes that scriptures are only fingers pointing at the moon, not the moon itself. You chant in unison with your fellow monks, the sound deep and resonant, filling the hall, the vibrations seeming to resonate in your bones. At night you sleep on a thin mat in an unheated room, the cold seeping through the walls, your sleeping quarters sparse and simple, containing nothing but the essentials. It is a life stripped of comfort, of distraction, of everything except the essential practice of awakening. And in that stripping away, something profound can be revealed, a clarity, a stillness, a sense of connection to the vast and silent ground of being that underlies all phenomena. But Kyoto is not only a city of samurai and monks, not only a place of temples and palaces and political intrigue. It is also a city of artisans, craftsmen whose skills are passed down through generations, refined over centuries into something approaching perfection, creating objects of such beauty and utility that they become treasures, passed from parent to child, preserved in temples and museums. In the district called Nishijin, in the northwestern part of the city, weavers produce silk fabrics of astonishing complexity and beauty, fabrics that are worn by emperors and empresses, by high-ranking courtiers and wealthy merchants, fabrics that are so valued that they become markers of status and wealth. They use looms that are marvels of engineering, complex wooden structures operated by foot pedals and hand levers, the shuttle flying back and forth between the threads, thousands of warp and weft threads interlocking to create patterns of flowers, waves, cranes, phoenixes, geometric abstractions, scenes from literature and mythology. The work is slow and demanding, requiring absolute concentration. A single bolt of fabric, enough for one kimono, might take weeks or even months to complete, depending on the complexity of the pattern. The patterns are planned in advance on graph paper, every thread's path mapped out, every color change noted. The dyes are made from natural materials gathered from across Japan and beyond: indigo from fermented leaves, crimson from safflower petals, purple from the roots of Gromwell plants, yellow from gardenia fruit, black from iron-rich mud. The colors are deep and rich, achieved through multiple dippings and careful control of temperature and acidity, and they do not fade even after centuries. A robe woven in Nishijin can last for generations, passed from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, a tangible link to the past, a carrier of family history and memory. In the foothills near Kiyomizu-dera, potters dig clay from the hillsides, clay that has special properties, fine-grained and plastic when wet, strong when fired. They shape it into tea bowls, vases, plates, sake bottles, roof tiles, using techniques that have been refined over centuries. They use simple kick wheels, their hands shaping the spinning clay with movements that are both powerful and delicate, learned through years of practice, movements that have become second nature. The vessels are dried slowly to prevent cracking, then decorated with glazes made from wood ash and metal oxides, formulas that are closely guarded secrets passed from master to apprentice. They are fired in wood-burning kilns built into the hillside, anagama kilns that take advantage of the natural draft of the slope, the flames roaring for days, sometimes for a week or more, reaching temperatures of over 1200 degrees Celsius that turn the clay into stone. The glaze melts and flows during the firing, creating surfaces that are unpredictable, mottled, streaked with ash from the burning wood, each piece unique. These imperfections are not considered flaws but rather enhancements, signs of the natural process, evidence of fire and time. A tea bowl with a crack that has been repaired with gold lacquer, a technique called kintsugi, is considered more beautiful than a flawless one, for the crack is part of the bowl's history, its journey through time, a visible reminder of impermanence and resilience. This aesthetic, known as wabi-sabi, values age, wear, roughness, the marks of use and time. It finds beauty in things that are humble, rough, incomplete, asymmetrical. It is the opposite of the courtly aesthetic which valued perfection and polish and symmetry, and it will come to define the Japanese artistic sensibility, influencing everything from architecture to poetry, to the arrangement of flowers. In Fushimi, at the southern edge of the city where the Kamo River widens, sake brewers work through the winter months when the weather is cold and the water is pure. Sake is made from rice, water, and koji, a mold called aspergillus oryzae that breaks down the starches in the rice into sugars, which are then fermented by yeast into alcohol, a complex process that requires precision and experience. The process is called multiple parallel fermentation, and it is unique to sake production, allowing for higher alcohol content than simple fermentation. The brewers work in cold, dark cellars called kura, their breath misting in the air, for sake brewing is a winter activity when the temperatures are naturally low and the risk of contamination is reduced. They polish the rice grains using machines or by hand, removing the outer layers which contain proteins and fats, leaving only the starchy core, the shinpaku, the heart of the rice. The degree of polishing affects the grade and flavor of the sake, with more polished rice producing more refined, delicate flavors. They wash the rice carefully to remove the powder from polishing, then steam it until it is cooked but still firm. They cool the rice and inoculate some of it with koji spores, spreading the rice on tables in a warm, humid room and stirring it periodically as the koji grows, covering each grain with a white bloom. They mix the koji rice with more steamed rice and water and yeast in large wooden vats, creating a starter mash called shubo or moto. They add more rice and water in stages over several days, building up the main mash called moromi, which ferments for several weeks, bubbling and hissing, the smell sweet and slightly sour, filling the kura with a distinctive aroma. When the fermentation is complete, they press the mash through cloth bags, the liquid dripping into waiting barrels, separating the sake from the solids. The best sake is clear as water or slightly golden, with a flavor that is both delicate and complex, hints of fruit and flowers, rice and earth, a clean finish that leaves the palate refreshed. It is drunk warm or cold depending on the season and the grade, in ceremonies and celebrations, an offering to the gods at shrines and temples, a necessity at weddings and festivals, and a balm for the human spirit, a way of creating warmth and conviviality in cold winter months. Incense makers in small shops along the back streets blend powdered woods, resins and herbs into compounds that are shaped into cones or sticks or pressed into elaborate shapes, creating scents that range from subtle to overpowering, from everyday to ceremonial. The ingredients are imported from across Asia at great expense: sandalwood from India and Indonesia, alizwood or agar wood from Southeast Asia, where certain trees produce aromatic resins in response to infection, frankincense and myrrh from the Middle East, camphor from China and Taiwan, cloves from the Spice Islands. The recipes are secret, complex formulas developed over generations, passed from master to apprentice, never written down but memorized, guarded jealously from competitors. The incense is burned in temples and homes, the smoke curling upward in thin streams, carrying prayers to the heavens and purifying spaces of evil influences and bad spirits. Different incenses are used for different occasions: heavy, formal incense for ceremonies, lighter scents like plum blossom or sandalwood for daily use. There is even a refined practice, an art form really, called kodo, the way of incense, one of the three classical Japanese arts along with chado, the way of tea, and kado, the way of flowers. In kodo gatherings, participants gather in a quiet room and take turns smelling small amounts of different rare incenses, trying to identify them blindfolded, discussing the subtle differences in scent, appreciating the depth and complexity, the way the aroma evolves as it burns. It is a refined and meditative form of entertainment, a way of training the senses and appreciating the subtle beauties of the natural world. And there are the woodblock printmakers, carvers and printers who will not reach their full flowering until the Edo period centuries later, but who are already beginning their craft in medieval Kyoto. They carve images into blocks of cherry wood, the lines precise and clean, cutting away everything that is not part of the image, leaving the design in relief. Ink is rolled onto the block with a wide brush or roller, and handmade paper, thin and strong, is pressed down by hand or with a device called a basin, transferring the image. If the print requires multiple colors, multiple blocks must be carved, one for each color, and the paper is printed again and again, each layer adding depth and complexity, the registration marks ensuring that each color layer aligns perfectly with the others. The subjects are varied: Buddhist images for devotional purposes, landscapes showing famous views, portraits of beautiful women, scenes from kabuki theater and classical literature, even erotic images called shunga, hidden in the back rooms of certain shops and sold to wealthy customers. The prints are affordable compared to paintings, accessible to merchants and townspeople who could never afford a painted scroll, a form of art for the common people rather than just the aristocracy. And they will eventually make their way to Europe in the 19th century, where they will inspire a generation of impressionist painters who will marvel at their bold compositions, their flat areas of color, their unusual perspectives, their willingness to crop images in unexpected ways. The relationship between master and apprentice is the foundation of all these crafts, the mechanism by which skills and knowledge are transmitted across generations without being lost. A boy, often as young as 7 or 8, sometimes even younger, is sent by his parents to live with a master craftsman, leaving his family home to become part of the master's household. He becomes in effect an adopted child, though his status is lower than the master's biological children. He sweeps floors and fetches water, and runs errands for years before he is allowed to touch the tools of the craft. He watches, constantly, learning by observation rather than instruction, for the master rarely explains things verbally. He is expected to absorb the knowledge through years of proximity, to understand not just the physical techniques but the mental approach, the spirit, the attitude, the way of seeing and thinking that defines the craft, the things that cannot be put into words. Only after years of this observation and menial work, sometimes a decade or more, is he allowed to try his hand at the actual craft. His first attempts are inevitably clumsy, failures, imperfect imitations of the master's work. The master corrects him with few words, sometimes just a gesture or a grunt, showing rather than telling. Slowly, painfully, through endless repetition and correction, the apprentice improves. He learns to feel the clay under his fingers, to understand when it is too wet or too dry. He learns to hear the loom, to know from the sound when the tension is wrong. He learns to see the grain of the wood, to predict how it will split, and how to work with it rather than against it. Eventually, if he is talented and persistent, if he dedicates his entire life to the craft, he becomes a master himself, takes on his own apprentices, and the cycle continues, an unbroken chain stretching back centuries. The dedication required of these craftsmen is absolute and consuming. A master lacquerware artist might spend months on a single piece, applying dozens of layers of urushi lacquer, each one requiring several days to dry properly in controlled humidity. Between layers, the surface must be polished smooth with charcoal and water, creating a finish of such depth and clarity that it seems to glow from within. The lacquer itself is harvested from trees, tapped like maple syrup, the raw sap toxic, and requiring careful handling. The techniques for working with lacquer have remained essentially unchanged for centuries, requiring patience and precision that modern mass production cannot replicate. Similarly, a master sword polisher, though swords are no longer used for combat, continues to practice his art on antique blades, using a series of increasingly fine stones to reveal the hamon, the temper line in the steel, bringing out the beauty hidden in the metal through weeks of careful work. Each of these crafts represents not just technical skill but a philosophy, a way of approaching work as a form of meditation, as a path to self-cultivation, as a contribution to the beauty and meaning of the world. But this world of refinement and craft, this carefully constructed civilization of beauty and order, is always precarious, always vulnerable to the chaos and violence that lurks beyond the city walls and sometimes erupts within them. No matter how refined the culture, how sophisticated the aesthetic sensibility, the reality of human conflict and ambition can shatter everything in an instant. In 1467, A dispute over succession to the shogunate ignites a conflict that will devastate Kyoto and plunge Japan into a century of civil war known as the Sengoku period, the age of the country at war. It is called the Onin War, named for the Onin era in which it begins, and it starts with two rival factions of the shogun's government, led by powerful daimyo, feudal lords, gathering armies and marching on the capital to enforce their claims. The fighting is brutal and indiscriminate, no longer the relatively civilized warfare of mounted warriors meeting in formal combat. The armies loot and burn without restraint. Great temples that have stood for centuries go up in flames, their wooden halls burning like torches, their priceless treasures looted or destroyed. The wooden mansions of the aristocracy are deliberately torched, the fire spreading from building to building through the densely packed neighborhoods. The streets become battlefields, trenches dug, barricades erected, fighting house to house. The war drags on for 10 years, neither side able to achieve a decisive victory, the armies feeding themselves by looting the city and the surrounding countryside. By the time the war finally ends in 1477, not through victory but through mutual exhaustion, much of Kyoto is in ruins. The palaces and temples that took centuries to build are reduced to ash and charred timbers. The population, which had numbered perhaps 200,000 before the war, has fled to the countryside or died of starvation and disease. Kyoto, the capital of peace and tranquility, becomes a ghost town, a place of rubble and wild dogs and desperate refugees living in the ruins. The destruction is almost total, a catastrophe that seems to mark the end of the city's greatness. But it is not permanent, for the Japanese genius is not just in creating beauty, but in accepting loss and starting again, in finding resilience in the face of catastrophe. Slowly, painfully, the city begins to rebuild. This process takes decades, even generations. But it happens. The temples are reconstructed, often on the same foundations, using the same techniques, sometimes salvaging materials from the ruins, sometimes starting completely fresh. New generations of artisans take up the old crafts, learning from the survivors who remember the old ways. Merchants return, reopening shops and workshops. The city that emerges from the ashes of the Onin War is different, simpler, less grand than the Heian capital at its height, but it is no less beautiful in its own way. The aesthetic shifts, becomes more austere. The opulence of the Heian court gives way to the simplicity championed by Zen. Gold leaf and brocade are replaced by rough wood and plain paper. Elaborate pond gardens give way to simple dry gardens of stone and gravel. The culture becomes increasingly obsessed with the idea of mono no aware, the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness that everything is transient, that beauty and sorrow are inseparable, that the very fact of impermanence is what makes things beautiful. Cherry blossoms are beautiful because they fall, not in spite of it. It is in this context of rebuilding and cultural transformation that the tea ceremony emerges as a central cultural practice, perhaps the most important artistic and spiritual practice in Japanese culture. Tea had been drunk in Japan for centuries, brought from China by Buddhist monks, first as a medicine, then as a stimulant to keep monks awake during long meditation sessions, eventually as a refined cultural practice among the aristocracy. But in the 16th century, a man named Sen-no Rikyu transforms it into something more, into an art form, a spiritual discipline, a complete philosophy of life expressed through the simple act of preparing and drinking tea. Rikyu is not a nobleman or a monk, but the son of a fish merchant in the port city of Sakai, a man of common origins who rises to become the most influential cultural figure of his age through sheer force of talent and vision. He studies under great tea masters, learning the techniques. He studies Zen Buddhism, absorbing its philosophy of simplicity and direct experience. And he synthesizes these influences into something new, something that will define Japanese aesthetics for centuries. Rikyu's great innovation is to strip away all unnecessary ornament, all pretension, all display of wealth and status. He designs tea rooms that are tiny, barely large enough for a few people to sit, often only 2 tatami mats in size, about 1.8 by 1.8 meters. The rooms are simple, utterly unadorned, built of rough natural materials, mud walls, thatched roofs, raw wood. They are lit by a single small window, creating a dim cave-like atmosphere. The entrance, called a nijiriguchi or crawling entrance, is so low that even a samurai must remove his sword and crawl on his hands and knees to enter, a gesture of humility and equality, for in the tea room all are equal, all social distinctions dissolve. Inside, there is a small alcove called a tokonoma, where the host displays a single scroll painting or piece of calligraphy, and arranges a single flower or branch, chosen carefully for its seasonal appropriateness and its subtle beauty. Everything is chosen for its simplicity, its naturalness, its ability to suggest rather than state. The tea ceremony, as Rikyu conceives it and teaches it to his students, is a ritual of precise movements and profound meaning, a choreography of gestures that has been refined over generations. The host prepares the tea room in advance, cleaning every surface until it is spotless, arranging the scroll and flower, setting out the utensils. The guests arrive and wash their hands and rinse their mouths at a stone basin called a tsukubai, purifying themselves before entering. They wait in a covered area called a makiai, contemplating the garden, quieting their minds. When the host signals that all is ready, they remove their shoes and enter the tea room, crawling through the low entrance, bowing as they enter. They admire the scroll in the alcove, commenting on its appropriateness and beauty, though the comments are understated, appreciative rather than effusive. They sit in formal scissor position, legs folded beneath them, backs straight, and wait in silence as the host enters and begins to prepare the tea. The host brings in the utensils one by one: the tea bowl, the whisk made from a single piece of bamboo, the tea scoop carved from bamboo, the tea caddy containing the powdered green tea. Each utensil is handled with care and respect, turned to show its best side to the guests. The host heats water in an iron kettle over a small charcoal fire built into the floor, the sound of the water heating described as a breeze in the pines, a natural sound that contributes to the meditative atmosphere. The host scoops tea into the bowl, adds hot water from a bamboo ladle, whisks it with quick, practiced movements until it forms a froth, a bright green foam. The bowl is then turned and offered to the first guest, who bows and takes it, turns it in his hands to avoid drinking from the front, admires its shape and texture and glaze, then drinks. The tea is bitter and earthy, an acquired taste, the flavor intense and pure. When finished, the guest wipes the rim and passes the bowl to the next guest, and so on until all have drunk. The ceremony can last for hours, but the time seems to dissolve. There is only the present moment, the sound of the whisk, the warmth of the bowl, the taste of the tea, the quiet companionship of the other participants. It is a meditation, a communion, a way of inhabiting time differently, of escaping the rush and noise of the world outside and entering a space of calm and presence. Rikyu famously writes that the essence of tea is simply to boil water, make tea, and drink it, nothing more. But contained in that simplicity is everything, the entire universe in a bowl of tea, all of Buddhist philosophy and Zen practice condensed into a single gesture. Rikyu's influence is profound and lasting, shaping not just the tea ceremony but the entire aesthetic sensibility of Japan for centuries to come. He teaches that beauty is not about decoration or display but about restraint and suggestion, that the most powerful art is the art that leaves space for the viewer's imagination, that hints rather than states, that values the journey over the destination. He teaches that imperfection is more interesting than perfection, more honest, more human, that a rough, misshapen tea bowl made by a rural potter with hands stained by clay can be more moving, more spiritually profound than a flawless piece of Chinese porcelain painted with elaborate designs. This is wabi-sabi, the aesthetic of the weathered, the worn, the humble, the incomplete. It is an aesthetic born of poverty and war, of a culture that has learned to find grace in scarcity, beauty in limitation, perfection in imperfection. Rikyu's life ends tragically, a victim of the very success that made him influential. He becomes too powerful, too proud, too influential, at the court of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the warlord who has recently unified Japan after a century of civil war, and who rules with absolute authority and a hair-trigger temper. The reasons for Hideyoshi's anger are disputed. Perhaps Rikyu charged too much for his services. Perhaps he placed a statue of himself in a temple gate where Hideyoshi had to walk beneath it. Perhaps he refused to give Hideyoshi his daughter as a concubine. Or perhaps the dictator simply grew jealous of the tea master's cultural influence. Whatever the reason, Hideyoshi orders Rikyu to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, and Rikyu, bound by the warrior code despite his merchant origins, obeys without protest. He prepares his own tea one last time, invites his closest students to share it with him, performs the ceremony with perfect grace, composes a final poem about the impermanence of life and the sharpness of his blade, and then drives the short blade into his abdomen, drawing it across in the prescribed manner, enduring the pain until his assistant, mercifully severs his head with a sword stroke. He dies at the age of 70, a master until the end. His death is both an end and a beginning. His teachings survive, passed down through his descendants who found the three main schools of tea that continue to this day, the Omotesenki, Irasenki, and Mushinoku-jisenki. His principles are refined and elaborated over the following centuries. The tea ceremony becomes one of the defining practices of Japanese culture, studied by millions, practiced in homes and temples and special tea houses, a living link to the principles of Zen and the aesthetic sensibility of wabi-sabi, a way of finding peace and beauty in a chaotic world. In the same centuries that see the rise of the tea ceremony and the dominance of Zen aesthetics, Kyoto also becomes the center of another cultural phenomenon, one that seems at first to contradict the austere spirituality of the temples, but which is actually deeply connected to the same philosophical understanding of impermanence and the fleeting nature of pleasure. This is the ukiyo, the floating world, the world of pleasure districts, of theaters and tea houses and courtesans, a world that exists in deliberate contrast to the strictures of samurai discipline and Confucian morality. The most famous of these districts is Heian, a maze of narrow streets and wooden buildings on the eastern side of the Kamo River, in the shadow of Yosaka Shrine. At night the streets of Heian glow with the warm light of paper lanterns, red and white, hung outside tea houses and restaurants. The sound of shamisen, a three-stringed lute with a distinctive twanging sound, drifts from behind closed doors and screens. Women in elaborate kimonos, their faces painted white with rice powder, their lips reddened with safflower paste, their hair piled high in elaborate structures studded with ornaments of tortoiseshell and silver, walk carefully on raised wooden sandals called okobo, that add 10 centimeters to their height and force them to take small mincing steps. These are geisha, though in Kyoto the proper term is gyoko, meaning woman of art, and their apprentices, maiko, and they are not prostitutes, though the distinction is often lost on outsiders and even on some Japanese from other regions. They are entertainers, artists trained from childhood in music, dance, conversation, the art of making guests feel welcome and delighted, the art of creating an atmosphere of refinement and beauty that transports visitors from the mundane world into a realm of aesthetic pleasure. A maiko begins her training as young as 15 or 16, though in earlier periods girls might begin even younger, at 12 or 13. She moves into an okiya, a geisha house, leaving her family home, run by an older woman called the okasan, literally mother, who becomes her guardian and manager. The okiya is a traditional wooden building, usually 2 or 3 stories, with sleeping rooms upstairs, a kitchen and dining area, and reception rooms where the geiko and maiko dress and prepare for their evening appointments. The maiko's training is rigorous and all-consuming, occupying every waking hour. She learns to play the shamisen, her fingers plucking the strings with a large plectrum called a bachi, practicing until her fingers bleed and then callous. She learns traditional dances called mai in Kyoto, movements so slow and stylized that they seem almost abstract, every gesture laden with meaning, every angle of the hand and tilt of the head expressing an emotion or telling a story. She learns the tea ceremony, spending hours mastering the precise movements, the proper way to whisk the tea, the proper way to bow and present the bowl. She learns flower arrangement, ikebana, the art of creating compositions with flowers and branches that express the beauty of nature and the passage of seasons. She learns calligraphy, practicing her brush strokes until they are confident and expressive. She learns how to dress in the elaborate kimono, which is actually multiple layers including undergarments, the main robe, an obi belt that can be 4 meters long and requires a special tying technique and various decorative cords and clasps. She learns how to paint her face with the white makeup, leaving the back of the neck bare in 3 prongs, considered the most erotic part of a woman's body in traditional Japanese aesthetics. She learns how to make conversation that is witty and engaging without ever being forward or inappropriate, how to pour sake, how to play drinking games, how to make each guest feel special and attended to. She is not allowed to have a boyfriend or any romantic entanglements. She is not allowed to use her mobile phone during working hours. She is, for those years of training, entirely devoted to mastering her arts, living in a bubble removed from normal modern life. When she finally debuts as a Maiko, usually after about a year of training, it is in a ceremony called Nais Dashi, literally shop opening, where she is formally introduced to the tea houses of Gion and to the Gaiko, who will become her older sisters and mentors. She is dressed in the full regalia of a Maiko, a long-sleeved furisode kimono in bright colors with elaborate designs, an obi tied in the distinctive Maiko style called darari no obi that hangs down almost to the ground, hair ornaments called kanzashi that change with each month and each season, flowers in spring, fans in summer, maple leaves in autumn, pine and bamboo in winter. She paints her face completely white, even her neck and chest, creating a mask-like appearance that is both beautiful and slightly uncanny. She wears the distinctive tall okobo sandals that make her taller but also constrain her movements, forcing her to walk in a distinctive swaying manner. And she begins her career as an entertainer, invited to ozashiki, banquets held in the private rooms of tea houses, where businessmen and politicians and wealthy tourists gather to drink sake, eat elaborate kaiseki meals, and be entertained by the presence and performances of Maiko and Gaiko. The world of the geisha is often misunderstood and romanticized, the subject of countless novels and films that exoticize and often misrepresent the reality. It is not a world of freedom or romance in the Western sense. It is a world of strict hierarchy and obligation, governed by complex rules and traditions. The Maiko and Geiko are bound to their okiya by debt, for the okiya pays for all their training and clothing and equipment, costs that run into the millions of yen, and the women must work for years to repay these debts. They are bound by tradition, by the expectations of a culture that values duty and loyalty, and the subordination of individual desire to group harmony. They are bound by the need to maintain the reputation of their okiya and of Gion itself, for any scandal or impropriety can affect the entire community. But it is also a world of artistry and discipline, a world where beauty is cultivated with an intensity that borders on obsession, where every gesture and every word is considered, where the goal is to create a perfect aesthetic experience, a few hours of escape from the ordinary world into a realm of grace and refinement. The geisha are the last keepers of certain arts, certain ways of moving and speaking and being that have almost disappeared elsewhere in Japan, swept away by modernization and westernization. To watch a geiko perform a traditional dance, her movements slow and deliberate, her face an expressionless mask that somehow conveys deep emotion, her kimono flowing around her like water, is to see a ghost, a fragment of the past made present, moving with a grace that seems to come from another dimension, another reality altogether. The geisha world is also a business, a carefully maintained tradition that depends on wealthy patrons willing to pay substantial sums for the privilege of their company. An evening at a first-class Gion tea house with Geiko and Maiko in attendance can cost hundreds of thousands of yen, putting it out of reach of ordinary people. The system is deliberately exclusive, deliberately mysterious, for mystery and exclusivity are part of the appeal. You cannot simply walk into a Gion tea house as a tourist and book a geisha. The tea houses operate on a system of introduction. You must be brought by an existing customer who vouches for you, who guarantees that you will behave appropriately and pay your bill. This system maintains standards but also limits access, creating a world within a world, a parallel reality that exists alongside ordinary Kyoto but which most people, even most Japanese, will never experience directly. And yet the geisha have become symbols of Kyoto, of traditional Japan, their image used to sell everything from tourism to whiskey, their distinctive silhouette recognized worldwide even if the reality of their lives and art is poorly understood. Throughout the year, Kyoto explodes into color and sound and motion during its many festivals, matsuri, events that transform the city from a place of quiet temples and orderly streets into something wild and joyous and communal. These festivals are not just entertainment or tourist attractions, though they have certainly become that in the modern era. They are communal rituals, expressions of gratitude to the gods and ancestors, celebrations of the turning seasons, moments when the boundary between the sacred and the everyday dissolves, when the entire community comes together in shared purpose. The most famous is the Gion Matsuri, held every July for the entire month, though the main events are concentrated in the middle of the month. It originated in the 9th century, in the year 869, as a purification ritual called a Goryo-ei, designed to appease the gods during a devastating epidemic that was killing thousands in the capital. The people believed that the plague was caused by angry spirits, onryo, the ghosts of those who had died unjustly, and they sought to pacify these spirits with prayers and offerings. The festival worked, or at least the plague ended, and the ritual was repeated in subsequent years, eventually becoming an annual event. Over the centuries, it has grown from a simple religious ceremony into a massive civic celebration, one of the three great festivals of Japan, attracting millions of visitors. The centerpiece of the Gion Matsuri is the Yamaboko Junko, the procession of floats that takes place on July 17th, the main day of the festival. The floats, called Yamaboko, are massive wooden structures, some as tall as 3-story buildings, weighing up to 10 tons. They are marvels of traditional carpentry, built without a single nail. The wooden beams fitted together with complex joinery, designed to flex and sway as they move through the streets. Each float represents a different neighborhood of Kyoto, and each has its own unique decorations and treasures. They are covered with elaborate tapestries, some of them priceless antiques imported from Persia and Belgium centuries ago, now protected as cultural treasures. They are decorated with carvings of phoenixes and dragons and mythical beasts, painted in brilliant colors and lacquered to a high sheen. They are topped with tall poles, the yama topped with pine trees, and the hoko topped with elaborate metal spires, and they are pulled through the streets by teams of men, sometimes as many as 50 men per float, dressed in traditional cotton robes and straw sandals, chanting ancient rhythmic calls as they heave on the heavy ropes, the floats rolling on wooden wheels that groan and creak, the sound echoing off the buildings. The atmosphere on the day of the procession is electric, festive, the streets lined with hundreds of thousands of spectators, the air thick with the smell of grilled food from street vendors, yakitori, and takoyaki, and sweet taiyaki, the sound of drums and flutes from the musicians who ride on the floats, playing traditional festival music that has not changed in centuries. In the evenings before the main procession, the floats are displayed on the streets, lit by hundreds of paper lanterns, creating a magical atmosphere. This is called Yoyama, the eve of the festival, and it is when Kyoto feels most alive, most connected to its past. People stroll through the streets in yukata, light cotton summer kimono, admiring the floats, eating and drinking, buying charms and souvenirs from the neighborhood associations. The old families who own the merchant houses along the parade route open their homes to the public, displaying family heirlooms and treasures, folding screens and ceramics and kimono that have been passed down for generations. It is a rare opportunity to see inside these traditional houses, to appreciate the accumulated beauty of centuries. The festival is also a form of civic pride, each neighborhood competing to have the most beautiful float, the best musicians, the most impressive display. It is a way for Kyoto to assert its identity, to celebrate its history and traditions, to remind itself and the world that despite modernization, despite the loss of political power, it remains the cultural heart of Japan. In spring, the city is consumed by hanami, cherry blossom viewing, a practice that goes back centuries, but which remains central to Japanese culture. The cherry trees, sakura, bloom for only 1 or 2 weeks, usually in late March or early April, depending on the weather. During that brief time, the parks and temple grounds are filled with people sitting on blankets beneath the trees, eating and drinking, composing poems, simply being present to the beauty of the moment. The blossoms are pale pink, almost white, delicate as tissue paper, covering the branches in clouds of color. They fall at the slightest breeze, drifting down like snow, carpeting the ground in pink and white. The sight is heartbreakingly beautiful precisely because it is so brief, because everyone knows that in a few days or a week the blossoms will be gone, blown away by wind and rain, leaving only green leaves. The falling blossoms are a symbol of life itself, lovely and fleeting, here and then gone, a living embodiment of the Buddhist concept of impermanence, mujo, the idea that all phenomena are transient, that nothing lasts, that attachment to ephemeral things causes suffering. The samurai identified strongly with the cherry blossom, seeing in its brief glory a reflection of their own code, a willingness to die at the peak of life, to fall beautifully, rather than wither slowly into old age and decrepitude. There is even a famous saying, among flowers the cherry blossom, among men the warrior, linking the two in a shared aesthetic of beautiful death. The best places for hanami in Kyoto are numerous. each with its own character. The Philosopher's Walk, a path along a canal lined with hundreds of cherry trees, becomes a tunnel of blossoms, the petals falling into the water and floating downstream like pink boats. Maruyama Park, near Yasaka Shrine, contains a famous weeping cherry tree, ancient and massive, its branches spreading like a fountain, lit up at night, so people can enjoy Yozakura, night cherry blossoms, the flowers glowing pale in the darkness. The Arashiyama district, in the western hills, offers cherry blossoms with a backdrop of mountains and the Togetsukyo Bridge spanning the Katsura River. The Imperial Palace grounds, normally closed, open to the public during cherry blossom season, allowing visitors to see the trees that bloom for the emperor. And there are countless small neighborhood parks and temple gardens where locals gather, bringing homemade food and sake, sitting on plastic tarps. The atmosphere relaxed and communal, a temporary equality, where salarymen and students and grandmothers all share the same space and the same appreciation of beauty. In autumn, there is momijigari, maple viewing, when the Japanese maples that cover the hillsides turn brilliant shades of red and orange and gold. The transformation happens gradually, beginning in the higher elevations in October and spreading down to the city by November, reaching its peak in mid to late November. The colors are intense, almost unreal. The leaves backlit by the sun seem to glow from within. The best places for autumn colors are the mountain temples, where maple trees were planted centuries ago specifically for this purpose. Tefukuji Temple has a valley filled with maples, crossed by a wooden bridge from which visitors can look down on a sea of red. Ikondo Temple has a garden designed around autumn colors, with paths that wind through groves of maples reflected in ponds. Kiyomizu-dera offers views of the entire city framed by autumn foliage. These temples become crowded during the peak season, thousands of visitors shuffling slowly through the grounds, but the beauty is worth the crowds, the sense of being part of an annual pilgrimage, a collective appreciation of nature's cycles. In winter there is tsukimi, moon viewing, a practice less widely observed than hanami, but cherished by those who understand its subtlety. People gather on the night of the full moon, especially the harvest moon in September or October, to appreciate its beauty. Offerings are made, rice dumplings called tsukimi dango, arranged in pyramids and seasonal grasses, sasuki, with their feathery seed heads. The moon is reflected in still ponds, and this reflection, the image rather than the moon itself, is often considered the true object of appreciation, for it is more ephemeral, more subject to disturbance, more perfectly embodying the principle of impermanence. There are famous moon viewing platforms at certain temples, designed specifically for this purpose. At Daikakuji Temple, the Asawa Pond was constructed in the Heian period for moon viewing parties, and the tradition continues today. The practice of moon viewing reflects the Japanese aesthetic preference for indirect experience, for suggestion over statement, for appreciating the reflection rather than the thing itself. But beyond the famous temples and festivals, beyond the well-trodden tourist paths, Kyoto is also a city of hidden corners, secret gardens, forgotten shrines, tucked away in the hills and back alleys. There are over 2,000 temples and shrines in the city and surrounding area. Far too many for any visitor to see, far too many even for most residents to know well. Some are grand and crowded, UNESCO World Heritage Sites with entrance fees and gift shops, but many are small and quiet, known only to locals, places where time seems to have stopped, where you can sit in silence and contemplation without another soul in sight. There is Sanzanin, a temple in the far northern mountains of Ohara, surrounded by moss gardens and cedar forests, accessible only by a long bus ride from the city center. The moss garden there is one of the most beautiful in Japan, a carpet of soft green moss covering the ground beneath ancient trees, dotted with tiny stone statues of Jizo, the bodhisattva, who protects children and travelers. The temple is associated with chanting practice, and if you visit early in the morning you might hear the monks chanting sutras, their deep voices resonating through the halls. There is Fushimi Inari Shrine, famous for its thousands of vermilion torii gates that form tunnels up the mountainside, donated by businesses and individuals seeking the favor of Inari, the rice god. The main shrine at the base of the mountain is crowded with tourists, but if you climb higher, following the paths that wind through the forest, the crowds thin out, and you find yourself alone in a landscape of gates and stone fox statues. for foxes are the messengers of Inari, supernatural beings with their own shrines and offerings. The path to the summit takes 2 or 3 hours of steady climbing, and along the way you pass dozens of smaller shrines and resting spots, each with a view of the city below, each with its own atmosphere. The upper reaches of the mountain feel ancient and wild, a sacred landscape barely touched by modernity. There is Kifune Shrine, hidden in a narrow valley north of the city, dedicated to the god of water. In summer, restaurants along the river set up platforms over the water where diners can eat while feeling the cool breeze off the mountain stream, a practice called kawa doko. In winter, the approach to the shrine is lit by paper lanterns, creating a pathway of light through the snow. The shrine is associated with matchmaking and love, and people come to write wishes on wooden plaques and tie them to racks, prayers for successful relationships or for rekindling lost love. The shrine also practices a unique form of divination, omikuji, drawn not randomly but by floating paper fortunes in the sacred spring, and reading the message that appears when the paper gets wet. There is a Tagi Nenbotsuji, a small temple in the Arashiyama Mountains, filled with 1,200 stone statues of Rakan, the disciples of Buddha, each one unique, each one carved with a different expression and pose, some serene, some laughing, some playing instruments, some engaged in mundane activities. The statues were carved by amateur sculptors and volunteers over a period of years as a community art project, and they transform the temple grounds into a whimsical landscape, a reminder that Buddhism need not be solemn, that joy and playfulness have their place in spiritual practice. There is Kazanji Temple, far in the western mountains, famous for preserving some of the oldest examples of Japanese manga, humorous scrolls depicting animals engaged in human activities, drawn by monks in the 12th and 13th centuries. The temple grounds include tea fields, for this is where tea was first cultivated in Japan, brought from China by the monk Aisai, who introduced Zen Buddhism. The setting is spectacular, overlooking a wooded valley, the buildings simple and harmonious with the landscape. There is the Philosopher's Walk, Tetsugaku no Michi, a 2-kilometer path that follows a canal in the Higashiyama district, connecting several temples. The path is named for Nishida Kitaro, one of Japan's most influential philosophers, who walked this route daily in meditation. The path is lined with cherry trees, spectacular in spring, and there are small cafes and galleries along the way, but it retains a quiet, contemplative atmosphere even during busy seasons. To walk this path is to follow in the footsteps of generations of thinkers and monks and poets who have found inspiration in this landscape. In the northern mountains, there are temples that can only be reached by long hikes through cedar forests, up steep paths lined with stone lanterns covered in moss and lichen. Jingoji Temple, Seimyoji Temple, Kozanji Temple, each one remote and atmospheric, each one requiring effort to reach, the journey itself a form of purification and preparation. The air in these mountain temples is thin and cool, scented with cedar and earth. The forest is silent except for the sound of your footsteps on the path, the occasional cry of a bird, the wind moving through the trees. When you finally reach the temple, it is often small, almost humble, a wooden hall with a thatched roof, the architecture simple and in harmony with the natural setting. Inside, a single Buddha sits in meditation, his surface darkened by age and incense smoke, his expression serene and compassionate. There is usually no one else there, no monks or priests or other visitors, just you and the Buddha and the silence. You light a stick of incense, bow and sit for a moment in the stillness, feeling the presence of centuries of practice, of countless pilgrims who have sat in this same spot, seeking the same thing, peace, understanding, connection to something larger than themselves. The temple feels ancient, as if it has always been here, as if it will always be here, long after you and everyone you know have returned to dust. These hidden places are the soul of Kyoto, more important in some ways than the famous landmarks. They are not on most tourist maps or in guidebooks. They are not famous or particularly spectacular in a conventional sense, but they carry a weight, a presence, an authenticity that the more visited sites sometimes lack. They remind you that Kyoto is not just a city of monuments and museums but a living organism, a place where the past and present coexist naturally, where the boundary between the seen and unseen is thin and permeable, where simply being present, simply paying attention, can become a form of meditation and prayer. As the centuries pass and Japan enters the modern period, Kyoto faces new challenges and transformations. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration overthrows the Tokugawa shogunate that had ruled from Edo, modern Tokyo, for over 250 years. The emperor, who has been powerless for centuries, a symbolic figure imprisoned in his Kyoto palace performing rituals, is suddenly restored to authority, at least nominally. But the new government, composed of young samurai from the provinces who have seized power in the emperor's name, immediately makes a fateful decision. They move the capital from Kyoto to Tokyo, taking the emperor with them. The official announcement is carefully worded, calling Tokyo the eastern capital and suggesting that Kyoto remains the western capital, but everyone understands the reality. Kyoto has lost its status as the capital of Japan, a status it had held for over 1,000 years. The imperial palace stands empty. The courtiers and aristocrats who depended on imperial patronage suddenly find themselves without purpose or income. Many of the great families fall into poverty. Some of the temples and shrines lose their support. There is a sense that the city is dying, that it has become irrelevant, a relic of the past that has no place in the new Japan that is rushing to modernize and westernize. The changes are dramatic and traumatic. Many of Kyoto's treasures are sold off, either deliberately or out of desperation. Art dealers from Europe and America arrive, buying up paintings and ceramics and sculptures for a fraction of their value, shipping them overseas where they end up in museums and private collections. Some temples are forced to sell their land to survive. The old merchant families try to adapt, investing in new industries, textiles and electronics and tourism. The city shrinks, its population declining as young people move to Tokyo and Osaka seeking opportunity. For several decades, from the late 19th to the early 20th century, Kyoto seems to be in terminal decline, a beautiful corpse slowly decomposing. But Kyoto survives. And not just survives but eventually thrives again, though in a different way than before. It survives in part because its culture is too deeply rooted to be easily uprooted, too important to Japanese identity to be abandoned completely. The craftsmen continue their work, passing their skills to the next generation even when demand is low. The tea masters continue to perform their ceremonies, maintaining the traditions. The geisha districts continue, adapting to new clientele, businessmen and politicians from Tokyo rather than courtiers and samurai. The festivals continue, year after year, maintained by neighborhood associations and supported by the city government, which comes to recognize their value, both cultural and economic. And in the 20th century, as Japan modernizes with breathtaking speed, as traditional culture disappears in Tokyo and other cities replaced by concrete and glass and neon, Kyoto becomes increasingly important as a symbol of continuity, a place where people can reconnect with traditions that are being lost elsewhere. The city becomes a place of pilgrimage, not just to shrines and temples for religious purposes, but to the idea of Japan itself, to an aesthetic and spiritual sensibility that defines the culture even as the physical reality of modern life moves further and further from that ideal. Students come to study tea ceremony and flower arrangement, and calligraphy, arts that are no longer part of everyday life, but which are preserved as cultural practices. Artists and writers come seeking inspiration, drawn by the city's beauty and its connection to the past. Tourists, first Japanese and then increasingly foreign, come to see the temples and gardens, to walk through Gion, to experience autumn colors and cherry blossoms, to feel the atmosphere of traditional Japan. The city learns to market its history and beauty, creating an infrastructure of hotels and restaurants and souvenir shops, sometimes compromising its character in the process, but also ensuring its survival and prosperity. During the Second World War, Kyoto is spared the firebombing that destroys so many other Japanese cities, the incendiary raids that turn Tokyo and Osaka and Nagoya into infernos. There are various theories about why. The most common story is that Henry Stimson, the U.S. Secretary of War, had visited Kyoto on his honeymoon in the 1920s and was moved by its beauty and cultural significance, and he personally intervened to remove it from the target list, arguing that destroying such a historically and culturally important city would be counterproductive, would make the Japanese fight even more desperately, and would be an act of cultural vandalism that America would come to regret. Other historians argue that the city was simply less important militarily and industrially than other targets, that its preservation was strategic rather than sentimental. Whatever the reason, Kyoto emerges from the war intact, its temples and gardens and old streets largely unchanged, one of the few places in Japan where the pre-war world still exists in physical form. After the war, during the occupation and the reconstruction period, this becomes increasingly important. Kyoto becomes a symbol of what was lost elsewhere, a repository of traditional culture, a living museum that helps Japan maintain connection to its identity even as the country rebuilds and transforms itself into a modern economic power. In 1950, the novelist Yukio Mishima publishes The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, a fictionalized account of a real event from 1950, when a mentally disturbed monk burned down Kinkaku-ji, destroying the 14th century building. The novel explores themes of beauty and destruction, of the impulse to destroy what one loves because its perfection is unbearable, because possession is impossible. The novel becomes internationally famous, putting Kyoto and its aesthetic philosophy before a global audience. The Golden Pavilion is rebuilt in 1955, an exact replica of the original, and it becomes more famous than ever, one of the most photographed buildings in Japan. Its image reproduced millions of times, symbolizing not just Kyoto but traditional Japan itself. The burning and rebuilding become part of its story, embodying the Japanese approach to preservation, not freezing things in time but accepting that loss happens and that rebuilding is possible. That tradition is not about maintaining original materials but about maintaining forms and techniques and spirit. In 1994, 17 of Kyoto's temples, shrines and gardens are designated as UNESCO World Heritage Sites under the collective title Historic Monuments of Ancient Kyoto. The sites include Kiyomizu-dera, Kinkaku-ji, Ginkaku-ji, the Silver Pavilion, Rionji, Nijo Castle, Nishi-Honginji Temple, and others. This international recognition brings both benefits and challenges. It brings prestige and tourism revenue, but it also brings crowds, commercialization, and the difficult task of balancing preservation with access. Some sites have become so crowded during peak seasons that the experience is more about managing crowds than about quiet contemplation. The city government implements various measures, limiting access at certain times, requiring advance reservations at some sites, trying to spread tourism more evenly throughout the year and throughout the city's many sites rather than concentrating on a few famous landmarks. Today, Kyoto is a city of contradictions and contrasts, ancient and modern existing side by side, sometimes harmoniously and sometimes in tension. The old wooden makiya townhouses stand next to modern concrete buildings. The geisha districts operate with smartphones and websites. The temples use LED lighting and security systems. The craftsmen use traditional techniques but also modern tools and materials when appropriate. The city has a subway system but also thousands of people riding bicycles along narrow streets. It has a population of 1.5 million, making it Japan's 7th largest city, but it has preserved its historic core in a way that larger cities like Tokyo and Osaka have not. The preservation is partly legal, building height restrictions and design guidelines that prevent the kind of high-rise development that dominates other cities, and partly cultural, a sense among residents that they are custodians of something important, that Kyoto belongs not just to them but to all Japanese, to all humanity really, as a repository of a particular approach to beauty and life. The essence of Kyoto is still there, beneath and alongside the modern overlay, if you know where to look and when to go. It is in the early morning before the tourists arrive, when you can walk through temple grounds and hear nothing but the wind in the pines and the distant sound of chanting from morning prayers. It is in the small neighborhood shrines, Shinto sanctuaries squeezed between buildings on ordinary streets, where locals stop on their way to work to bow and clap and pray, leaving offerings of rice and sake and coins, maintaining a connection to the kami that has existed for centuries. It is in the workshops where an old potter shapes a tea bowl on his wheel, his movements unchanged from those of his ancestors centuries before, his hands reading the clay, knowing exactly when to press harder and when to ease up, when to add water and when to let it dry. Knowledge that cannot be learned from books or videos, but only from years of practice under the guidance of a master. It is in the gardens where the moss has been growing for 500 years, tended by each generation of monks, watered during dry periods, cleared of fallen leaves in autumn, protected from damage. the continuity unbroken, the same moss that medieval monks saw and touched, still living, still growing, connecting past and present in a literal physical way. Kyoto is a city that teaches patience, that rewards attention, that reveals itself slowly over time. It does not give up its secrets easily or quickly. It asks you to slow down, to notice details that most people rush past, the way light falls on a stone at a particular time of day, creating shadows and highlights that transform something ordinary into something beautiful. It asks you to notice the pattern of lichen on a temple roof, to see it not as decay but as a form of beauty, nature reclaiming human constructions, the organic and inorganic merging. It asks you to notice the sound of water trickling through a bamboo pipe in a garden, the distinctive tock sound when the pipe fills and tips, scaring away deer and marking time in a non-mechanical way, a clock that measures moments by the accumulation of water drops rather than the movement of gears. It asks you to accept imperfection, to see beauty in things that are worn and weathered and incomplete, to understand that perfection is sterile, that it is the irregularities and asymmetries that make things interesting, that give them character and soul. It asks you to hold lightly to the things you love, knowing that they will not last, that change is inevitable, that loss is part of life. This is the lesson of the cherry blossom, beautiful precisely because it falls. This is the lesson of the tea ceremony, finding perfection in a single, unrepeatable moment. This is the lesson carved into the very stones of the city, written in the grain of its ancient timbers, expressed in every ritual and ceremony and craft. Nothing is permanent. Everything changes. And in that change, in that impermanence, there is a kind of beauty, a poignancy, a depth that permanence could never offer. The legacy of Kyoto extends far beyond its physical boundaries, far beyond its role as a tourist destination or a museum of traditional culture. It is in the way of seeing, the way of being, the philosophical and aesthetic approach to life that the city embodies and has refined over centuries. It is in the idea that beauty and meaning are found not in grand gestures or expensive materials but in small, careful acts of attention, in the way you arrange flowers or prepare tea or walk through a garden. It is in the belief that tradition is not a dead weight or a constraint but a living practice, something that must be constantly renewed and reinterpreted by each generation, not copied mechanically but understood deeply and expressed in contemporary terms while maintaining connection to the principles and spirit of the past. It is in the understanding that simplicity can contain infinite complexity, that a single flower in a vase or a bowl of tea or a garden of stones and gravel can be a doorway into the depths of existence, a meditation on the nature of reality, a way of experiencing the sacred in the ordinary. Kyoto has been a capital of emperors and a center of courtly refinement. It has been a city of warriors and monks, of artists and craftsmen. It has been burned and rebuilt more times than can be counted, destroyed by war and earthquake and fire, and each time it has risen again, not identical to what came before, but carrying forward the essential forms and practices and spirit. It has been a center of political power, and then lost that power, become a backwater, and then reinvented itself. It has produced some of the greatest art and literature in human history, works that continue to be read and appreciated and studied 1,000 years after they were created. It has been a laboratory for ideas about beauty, about time, about the nature of self and world, ideas that have influenced not just Japan but the entire world, spreading through Zen Buddhism and the tea ceremony and martial arts and art and architecture, creating a distinctive aesthetic that is immediately recognizable even if its philosophical foundations are not always understood. And through all of this, through all the changes and challenges and transformations, Kyoto has remained, stubbornly, impossibly, essentially itself. A city of wood and paper and tile that has survived for over 1,200 years in a land of earthquakes and typhoons, that has preserved its essential character despite war and modernization and the pressure to become like everywhere else. A city that seems to exist in defiance of the laws of entropy and decay, that insists, quietly but firmly, that the past is not over. That tradition is not nostalgia or regression, but a resource, a foundation, a set of principles and practices that remain relevant and valuable, that can guide us in our lives, even in the 21st century. A city that insists that beauty still matters, that aesthetic experience is not a luxury or a decoration, but a fundamental human need, a way of finding meaning and connection in a world that often seems chaotic and meaningless. To walk through Kyoto today, to actually be there in the physical space rather than seeing it through photographs or videos, is to walk through layers of time, each one visible and tangible if you know how to look. The grid laid out by Emperor Kammu in 794 is still there, beneath the modern streets and buildings. The pattern still discernible in the layout of blocks and the orientation of streets. The temples built in the 12th and 13th centuries still stand, their wood dark and weathered by centuries of weather, their tiles thick with moss and lichen, their foundations settled deep into the earth. The gardens raked by Zen monks in the 15th century are still raked every morning by contemporary monks following the same patterns, using the same techniques, the lines fresh and new but also ancient, unchanged in their essential form. The tea rooms where Sen-no Rikyu taught his students in the 16th century are still used for tea ceremonies, the tea still whisked in the same bowls or in bowls made by contemporary potters following the same principles, the ritual performed with the same careful attention to every gesture and moment. The geisha still walk through Gion at dusk, their faces painted white, their kimonos rustling, moving with the same distinctive gait, their presence a living connection to the pleasure quarters of the Edo period. The festivals still happen every year, the floats still roll through the streets pulled by teams of sweating men, the drums and flutes playing the same melodies, the crowds gathering to watch just as they have for centuries. The cherry blossoms still bloom in spring, and the maple leaves still turn red in autumn, marking the passage of seasons just as they did 1,000 years ago, reminding everyone who sees them of the beauty and sadness of impermanence. And in all of this, in the persistence of forms and practices and beauty through centuries of change, there is a kind of miracle, not a supernatural miracle but a human one. The miracle of continuity, of cultural memory, of a society that has chosen to preserve and honor its past even as it moves into the future, that has decided that some things are worth keeping, worth protecting, worth passing on to the next generation, even if they are not economically productive or technologically advanced, even if they seem quaint or old-fashioned by modern standards. Kyoto is not frozen in time. It is not a theme park or a Disneyland version of traditional Japan, despite what some critics say. It is a living city, full of people going to work and school, full of restaurants and shops and businesses, full of traffic and noise and all the usual features of urban life. But it is a city that has made space for its past, that has integrated tradition into contemporary life in a way that few other cities have managed. It is a city that has decided that the old ways are worth keeping, not as museum pieces or tourist attractions, but as living practices, as ways of life that still have meaning and value, that can still teach us something important about how to live, how to see, how to be in the world. The lesson of Kyoto, if there is one single lesson to be drawn from its long and complex history, is about the relationship between permanence and change, about how those two things that seem to contradict each other are actually inseparable, actually the same thing seen from different angles. Everything changes, that is the fundamental law of the universe, the principle of impermanence that Buddhism teaches, and yet the patterns persist, the forms continue, the spirit endures. The tea bowl breaks and it is repaired with gold lacquer, and the repair becomes part of its beauty, part of its history, part of its value. The temple burns down, and it is rebuilt using the same techniques and materials, and the rebuilding is an act of faith and defiance, a statement that what matters is not the age of the physical materials but the continuity of form and purpose. The cherry blossoms fall, scattered by wind and rain, and for a moment there is only loss and sadness, but next spring they will bloom again, and the cycle will continue, and the falling becomes meaningful precisely because of the blooming, and the blooming becomes precious precisely because of the falling. This is the rhythm of Kyoto, the heartbeat of the city, a pulse that has been steady for over 1,000 years, a rhythm of creation and destruction, of building and burning, of blooming and falling, of life and death and rebirth. As our long journey through Kyoto comes to its end, we find ourselves standing once again in the pre-dawn darkness, the same moment where we began so many hours ago. The temple bell tolls, the sound deep and resonant, carrying across the valley, fading slowly into silence. The mist rises from the Kamo River, obscuring the lower city, making the temples on the hills seem to float above a sea of white. The mountains stand silent and watchful, their dark forms just beginning to be visible as the sky lightens almost imperceptibly in the east. The city is waking, slowly, gently, preparing for another day of work and prayer and beauty, another day of tourists and traffic and all the complexities of modern urban life, but also another day of rituals and ceremonies and careful attention to beauty, another day of connection to a past that is not dead but living, not fixed but flowing, not a burden but a resource. Somewhere in a Zen temple, a monk in black robes is raking gravel, creating patterns that will last only until the next rain, creating beauty that exists fully only in this moment. Somewhere in Gion, a Maiko is practicing her shamisen, her fingers plucking the strings again and again, the same phrase repeated until it is perfect, or rather until it is perfectly imperfect, human and alive. Somewhere in a small workshop, a potter is shaping clay on a wheel, his hands moving with the confidence of decades of practice, creating a bowl that will be used and cherished and eventually broken and perhaps repaired with gold. The past and present are folded together, inseparable, a single continuous moment stretching back 1200 years and forward into an unknown future that the city will face with the same resilience and adaptability that it has shown throughout its history. Kyoto is a city that asks to be remembered, not as a monument to a dead past, but as a living example of what is possible when a culture decides to honor its own deepest values, when it chooses beauty over efficiency, continuity over novelty, depth over speed, quality over quantity, being over having. It is a city that whispers rather than shouts, that reveals itself slowly to those who are patient enough to wait and attentive enough to notice. It is a city of shadows and suggestions, of things half seen and half understood, of meanings that emerge only gradually through repeated exposure. A city that mirrors the mind itself, vast and mysterious and ultimately unknowable, offering endless opportunities for discovery and contemplation. It is a city that teaches us that beauty is not something we possess but something we participate in, not something we buy but something we create through our attention and care, not something permanent but something we must constantly renew. It is a city that reminds us that we are not separate from the past or the future, that we are part of a continuous stream of human experience, that our choices and actions matter because they become part of the story that future generations will inherit. And so our story of Kyoto, the hidden city of 1,000 shrines, the secret heart of Japan, comes to an end, though the city itself does not end. It continues, day after day, season after season, year after year, century after century, its temples standing against the passage of time, its gardens growing and changing while remaining essentially themselves, its festivals marking the turning of the seasons and the cycles of human life, its craftsmen creating beautiful objects that embody centuries of accumulated wisdom and skill. The Lion of St. Mark may have fallen silent in Venice, but the temple bells of Kyoto still ring, their sound carrying across the valley, a reminder that some things endure, that some places hold a kind of magic, a presence that cannot be destroyed or forgotten, that speaks to something deep in the human spirit, our need for beauty and meaning, and connection to something larger than ourselves. Thank you for joining me tonight, on this long journey through time and space, through history and memory, through the streets and temples and gardens of one of the world's most remarkable cities. I hope you have felt something of the spirit of this place, its beauty and its sorrow, its grandeur and its humility, its strength and its fragility. I hope you have sensed the presence of the countless people who have walked these same streets before us, who have sat in meditation in these same temples, who have prepared tea in these same rooms, who have admired cherry blossoms and autumn leaves and moonlight on water, who have found in Kyoto something precious and irreplaceable, a way of being in the world that honors both tradition and change, both permanence and impermanence, both the human and the natural, both the material and the spiritual. Until we meet again in another story, in another place, in another time, I wish you peace and rest and beautiful dreams. Sleep well, and let your dreams be filled with the sound of temple bells echoing across misty valleys, with the scent of incense and cedar and green tea, with the sight of cherry blossoms falling like snow and maple leaves burning like fire, with the feeling of tatami beneath your feet and the warmth of tea bowls in your hands, with tea ceremonies performed in silent rooms and gardens of raked gravel stretching toward infinity. The archive of history closes its doors now, but the stories remain, waiting in the darkness, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be told again to new listeners who seek wisdom and beauty and connection to the vast river of human experience that flows from the past through the present into the future. May you find in your own life some of what Kyoto offers, some measure of peace and beauty, some connection to tradition and community, some appreciation of impermanence and the preciousness of each passing moment. Good night, and thank you for listening.